I've been using float tanks infrequently for the past few years, and then last year decided to combine two of my favorite experiences, LSD and sensory deprivation tanks. I have tripped in a sensory deprivation tank for 3 hours. Although it was only a tab that I estimate to be a little over 100 micrograms, it was one of the most powerful experiences I've ever had on LSD, even compared to the time I took about 350 micrograms. I highly recommend if you're both an experienced floater and LSD user to try this, as I cannot even begin to describe this experience within text. I'll describe one of the experiences as well as I can in this comment. Due to the almost complete lack of sensory information coming in, my mind began to create its own reality around me. I was seeing myself sunken into a pinkish iridescent gelatin-like substance that had an indent perfectly shaped for my resting body. As thoughts passed through my mind, I saw jagged spikes emerge from the gelatin, bright, new, and terrifying. It was all very overwhelming. At one point, I even felt hands grab onto my waist and attempt to push me down a little into the water, yet it didn't frighten me at all. It seemed almost playful and teasing. It was also a very sensual and empowering experience when I ran my hands along my body. Given that I hadn't truly seen myself for multiple hours, I felt beautiful. The way I felt under my own hands seemed ideal, and I realized I really wouldn't want to look any other way. I've recently lost quite a bit of weight, and it made me feel somewhat unlike myself. This experience remedied any self-doubt regarding my physicality. Towards the end, I experienced almost a sense of vertigo, as my body seemed to be telling me that the tank I was in had been inverted in some way, and I now felt even more like I was floating. It's very difficult to describe more of what was going on in my head because it felt simultaneously as I had been in the tank for years, as well as only a few minutes. I was able to manipulate my thoughts and take myself down whatever path I desired, mentally. This is why I believe this way of spending an LSD experience is extremely conducive to it being used for its therapeutic properties. Towards the very end of my experience, as the music began to play, signaling my 3 hours were up, I did some Kundalini yoga kriyas for about 10 minutes before exiting. It was a beautiful way to decompress and remind myself of the power and capability within me. I also did more kriyas after having exited the tank when I was in the shower before I would finally leave the clinic. My ex-boyfriend owns the clinic I attended, so it was somewhat jarring to exit my room with my hair wet and my pupils massive to see him. I quickly paid and he asked about my experience, which I told him very briefly was good. That still is funny to me to describe that experience as good, given that it was so far beyond that. I experienced a traumatic event about 3 years ago and still deal with it to this day, and experiences such as these help me greatly in reducing my paranoia and allowing me to emphasize characteristics of myself that I love. I highly recommend doing this if you have experienced both of these practices separately. It has great potential for therapeutic experiences and self-discovery. You should know what I've described here really only scratches the surface of what I experienced in those 3 hours. TLDR. Just do it. Last year, I took 350 micrograms, 2 white and white tabs at 175 each, 30 minutes before a 4-hour float session. My partner had gifted me 2 vouchers, each for a 2-hour float at our local center. I had already been there once before and really enjoyed it, so I rang them up to ask if I can combine both vouchers into a singular float session. I already had the tabs and knew how strong they were. My intention was to go deep, so I decided to take 1.5 tabs beforehand, with a top-up if needed. I couldn't remember the location, and my Uber driver asked if they could drop me a couple of minutes from the spot as it was down a one-way street. I could feel the tabs when I got out of the car and was getting a bit nervous that I wasn't going to make it in time. When I got in, I was trying to hide the fact that I was coming up, so I made some brief small talk with the people behind the desk, not really sure if they could tell if I was altered or not. The LSD started coming on strong once I had made it into the tank, and I was writhing inside the tank like a snake. I started to get images of giant futuristic machines, cogs, etc. However, these were very faint, and while slightly akin to DMT in their nature, they had no clarity or crispness. As I went deeper, I got a very strong image of my granny, who was sick in a hospital bed. She actually was in the hospital at this time, which she had been for a little while. I knew she was on her way out. However, in this vision, I remember having an exchange with her, but I can't remember what the details of it were. I can remember feeling sad seeing her like that, and that my vantage point appeared to be hovering above her. I don't have too much memory of this part, however I do recall needing to wee and stepping out of the tank. The minute I made it out, I was hallucinating wildly, with fractals spinning off the surfaces of the room. I remember these open-eye visuals being quite tryptamine-like in nature. I went down the hall to the toilets, hoping I wouldn't run into anyone who might see my eyes. After I was finished, I reached for the lock on the door, and then realized that I couldn't work out the mechanism on the lock. This had me panicking for a good few minutes as I became more and more anxious that I was going to be stuck in the loo and have to either break the door down and deal with the consequences whilst tripping, or call for help and be in the same situation when the staff realized that I was just tripping too hard to work out a simple door lock. Eventually, after a quick spiral into rising fear, I made it out and back to the tank, which felt like a welcome return to peace and nothingness. No visuals to speak of, just endless space. At some point during this time, I took the remaining half tab and the last few hours were of similar vein. The next day after this experience, my granny died in the hospital. I knew she was dying, so it is most likely I was trying to process this, hence the vision of her. For a while afterwards, I thought her consciousness might be reaching out to me, as we were quite close. If there is one aspect of human existence we don't have much of an understanding of, it is surely consciousness, so who knows? I had taken acid with my partner a half dozen times before this particular trip, and my experiences had always been pleasant with rather gentle psychedelic effects. We would listen to music or watch a film or just hang out together, but this particular time was completely different, completely unexpected, and changed my life in ways I'm still trying to comprehend. My partner and I had booked a 90-minute session at a float place for this particular evening, and we decided it would be fun to trip while floating. It was our first float. For those who don't know, the float experience involves submerging yourself naked in a tank of warm salt water. You can have lights on or be in total darkness. Some find it very relaxing or meditative. We ingested the acid at our home about an hour before our appointment, both of us feeling positive and looking forward to this new experience. We think the dosage was the same for both of us. For my partner, the acid kicked in almost immediately. For me, it took about an hour. During the float, I felt male and female energy both rushing through me. An image of a middle-aged woman with long curly gray hair kept manifesting in my mind. When I got out of the tank, I looked in the mirror, always an interesting thing to do while tripping, and watched my face rippling from male to female and back. This was just the beginning. The float over, my partner and I decided to get something to eat. We walked a short distance to an Asian cafe and ordered soup and rice, and were generally acting pretty silly and giggly, but more or less in control. My partner paid for the food and we left. At this point, my memory of real-time events dissolves. I was in a cosmic cafe. I don't know how to explain this, but my consciousness was splintered into many different awarenesses. I was still me, but somehow I also was everyone else at the same time, and everything was happening all at once. There was no time, only an eternal now. I felt that this was ultimate reality, which had always existed and always will. I just hadn't been able to experience it until now, until the LSD unlocked or opened something in my mind. I knew my partner was besides me, but in a way, there was no difference between he and I. I could feel his earthly desires, a distraction from spiritual reality, and his fears as my own, as anyone's. I heard voices all around me, speaking in many languages that did not sound foreign, but there was no sense of confusion, only harmony. I looked at the faces around me in this cafe. They shimmered with change, with beautiful symbols and colors. They changed constantly from one ethnicity to another, from male to female, and there was a harmony in all the changes. Nothing remained constant, and yet, it all seemed natural. Sometimes I heard chimes, as though something was trying to get my attention or calling me to focus. I had a feeling of being welcomed. Now you see how it is. A feeling of being lovingly encouraged, guided through this new reality which I'd been blind to until now. The voices I heard were always saying things that related directly to my experience. Unfortunately, I can't remember much of what I heard, but I do remember someone saying, "It's disorienting at first." I remember my partner eating greedily, frantically, and saying, "I feel like there's a hole inside me." I realized that although I had always seen myself as a hedonist, one who distracts themselves with worldly pleasures to avoid feeling pain, my partner was just the same. I saw him as an old man who would one day die and decompose, but he was also a sort of acid trickster who had been there many times before. He too was welcoming and grinning. I wasn't sad at the thought of him dying because I knew he had always existed and always would in some way. Later, I know that I ascended even higher and glimpsed vast unfolding complexities, which I can only describe as branching out further and further, revealing a higher wisdom. Even as I type this, I know it sounds like a lot of trite New Age nonsense. As I descended back to myself, I knew that I would forget it all. I saw and felt that the universe is forever in a grand cycle, like planets eternally rotating, and that fear, love, disgust, anger, compassion are always floating through the universe and through all of us as part of the human experience. Those of us who are pulled into fear or hate or negativity must repeat life until they return into harmony with the great reality. I felt sad about this, about all of the suffering that humans experience as they repeat lifetimes over and over. I asked repeatedly, why does there have to be fear and negativity at all? The answer was simply, this is how it is, and always has been, and always will be. There was a point when I realized, or was shown, that anything is possible, there are no limits. I was holding on to my rational, logical mind, and knew I could let it go. And for a second I experienced this, and since rationality or sanity is what anchors us in reality, it was very frightening. I could let go of my perceived orientation in space and it wouldn't matter. At this point, I realized we had been walking down the street because I fell down and bumped my head slightly. A very kind woman came over to help me to my feet. I remember she was Asian and wore a jade bracelet that burned with light. She asked if I needed help and I whispered no and thanked her several times. Such kindness was shown to me that night. I began to move toward ultimate reality. I wanted to become one with it. I could have completely merged with the infinite. I felt myself beginning to, but a part of me wanted to return to an individual life, a beautiful, ugly, hard, limited awareness, painful life, where I would be best able to love and to practice compassion. Then things began coming into focus. I could smell the harsh artificial odors of city streets and air freshener or perfume. I felt cold. I knew I was in a car with a seatbelt on. I did not like feeling restrained by the seatbelt, and my partner was in the back seat, very concerned about me. I was holding on to nausea. Something told me to let it go, and I threw up. I was still afraid of something, still holding on to something, unwilling to let go. But I let myself come back down to earth. I let the amnesia take over. I felt very cold and heavy and wobbly. The driver, bless her, was so kind to me even though I'd just been sick in her car. She took me by the hands and guided me toward our apartment very slowly and gently. I looked into her face. She appeared to be a sort of bird-woman hybrid, maybe part owl or part hawk, and she was infinitely loving and wise. I think I embraced her and felt my hands melt into her. I remember coming into the apartment and our little dog trotting out to greet us, all anxious and happy as always. My partner got me to sit down and took my shoes off with some difficulty. Then I got undressed and went into the bathroom. It was over. I want to note that my partner's experience was extremely different. Later he told me that he could see I was way out there, and he was afraid for me when I fell down and when I got sick. He was much more in control of himself than I was. Since that night, my life hasn't been the same. I am consumed with a newly awakened hunger for spiritual knowledge. I've been reading Hindu and Buddhist teachings. They resonate for me. When I see people, I imagine we are all splinters of a great unity. There is no real separation between us. I was never really afraid of death before, but now I am reassured that there is nothing at all to fear. All of us emerge from the great unity, and we all return to it. I've been grappling with new ideas, particularly the profound concept of consciousness. I realize now that consciousness is not limited to our brains. It is a shared reality, perhaps an energy field, again, sounding new agey. The most mind-blowing idea of all is, what if the universe itself is conscious? What if it is alive in a way we can hardly conceive of? Is that what people mean when they speak of God? I thought it would be easy. Lay back, close my eyes, and let the colors unfold and amaze me. As I lay in the tank, it became apparent that a pleasure trip was not in store for me. In the dark chamber, there was no difference between eyes closed and eyes open. I focused on my usual closed-eye static, which was equal to what I always see before going to bed. Neither the tank nor the 2CE changed it at all, whereas the 2CE usually blows my mind at this point. A period of waiting began. I suspect that most people won't be able to get beyond this waiting. They will either get out of the tank due to boredom or some faux illness, or not allow it to end. I felt that weird impulse, which I suspect is common to all humans, to cling to my boredom and rigid thinking. During this waiting period, the few psychedelic effects I experienced manifested themselves. The edges of my mind of vision flickered a little from time to time. This was barely perceptible, and I suspect that it was only a normal body quirk which I noticed due to my unusual situation. Slight vertigo. I felt as if I had floated sideways in the tank, which was impossible, or like the tank had inclined 15 degrees, a cool effect considering the water should have pooled at my feet. Thinking in sounds. Through the whole process, I never stopped thinking, never reached a Zen state of blissful mind silence. I now see just how much work that will be for me. However, during the waiting period, my thoughts would trail off and turn into the sound of Indian music. Some of the noises sounded remarkably similar to the sitar. Then the experience began in earnest. It was around the 35-minute mark. Through the whole thing, my sense of time was not distorted, and I didn't even realize it was happening at first. I thought my mind would eventually clear and I would be treated to a light show or something, until I started thinking about myself. First, I realized that I'm not a visually oriented person. I never spend time thinking about how things look or anything like that. Then I started thinking about all other aspects of my life. It's a little too personal to spread around the internet, or maybe the internet is the perfect impersonal medium to blather in, so I won't indulge myself. Suffice it to say that my world was rocked, and I ended the hour taking an ice cold shower, crying, feeling like I had been raped. But calling it rape was only a lie to myself, and a way to get your attention. What I really think happened was that I was judged, in the way that really matters. Permanent, truthful judgment. If that sentence doesn't strike you as god-awful, you are either a saint, a child, or an idiot. Remember, for me it was like rape. My only real sin is indulgence, and though my indulgences are frequent, they are seldom worse than a night of drinking. However, I expect to spend a lifetime trying to redeem myself, for redemption only comes to the sadist after painful death. First, let me give you some background so that you may understand, more clearly, my intentions and methods. I am an experienced psychedelic voyager. I have experimented with the majority of psychedelics out there, and even with some lesser-known ones such as Apina on my travels to South America. I believe that there are two types of psychedelic users out there. Neither is better nor more noble than the other, and most of us cross over between the two types regularly. The first would be what I call the recreational user. This user consumes psychedelics for the pure enjoyment of the trip. The other type, which I classify myself as, is the searcher. This user is searching for something that they hope will be provided by the substance and furthering state of mind. For each searcher, the goal is different. Some search for scientific knowledge, while others search for spirituality. My quest is for a state of mind that many of you already enjoy without the use of psychedelics. I have an extremely logical and scientific mind. I am constantly looking for the logical reason for everything. As a result, I am unable to believe in a god. I am an atheist by nature, and I long for, even if only for a moment, that bliss and contentment that comes with faith in something larger. Don't get me wrong, I do not want to find God. I want to feel and understand what the majority of the planet already feels. Although I have experienced 2+4 states, Shulgin rating scale, I have not attained my goal, but I believe it is still possible by combining substances and environments to reach that state. Okay, enough with my babble, on to the trip report. Year 2001, trip 11 for the year so far. 15.5 grams of heavenly blue morning glory seeds, cold water extraction. 2 grams of cannabis, smoked. Homemade isolation tank, 164 gallons of water heated at 94 degrees, body's external temperature. 850 pounds of magnesium sulfate, earplugs. 7 p.m., ingested extraction. 8:30 p.m., felt a bit speedy and restless, slight nausea, smoked 2 grams of cannabis to ease stomach and take the edge off. 10:30 p.m., I began to experience slight patterning and melting, nothing truly amazing. I began to have some trouble concentrating while watching the television. 11 p.m., major tactile hallucinations began setting in. My skin felt like it was crawling and popping, if that makes any sense. Patterning became very intense, and I felt like I was continually swaying from side to side. I turned off the television and put on some music, closed my eyes and tried to concentrate. I had the sensation the music was coming from my nose. 11:30 p.m., turned off the music and closed myself in an empty closet. The visuals seemed to be an explosion of primary colors. This is odd seeing as I am colorblind. I believe the colors were blues and greens. Visuals were not intensifying, so I climbed into the tank. 12:30 a.m. After 1 hour in the tank, it's hard to describe what was going on. I felt like I was awake, but for some reason, during the trip, I could not discern the difference between being awake and dreaming. There was major twitching and a very painful muscle spasm in my right leg. Every now and then, I felt like somebody was pushing me under the water. Visuals became extremely vivid and intense. I would scale this at +2, dipping into +3 for sometimes up to 15 minutes. The visuals varied. At one point, it seemed like every memory I had in my brain was a snapshot, and these snapshots would quickly flash before me, only to be replaced by another. It was much like flipping through a stack of photos very quickly. I reasoned that this may be the experience people go through when they have near-death experiences. Not that I felt like I was dying, but it seemed very like the my life flashed before my eyes kind of thing. Some visions were not really comprehensible, but the one that really sticks with me is kinda silly, but what I got out of it was very nice. I was standing on a road, watching a woman in a go-kart taking a very sharp turn. This vision repeated countless times. None of the actions changed, but every time she made the turn, the look of the vision changed. Sometimes in slow motion, sometimes fast, other times choppy. Each time I saw it, I got a different feeling. Sometimes it looked terrifying, other times it looked sensual or funny. I concluded that the mood of the moment changed and was determined by the lighting, speed, and smoothness. I know this is not a huge mind-altering event, but it really made it clear to me how important mood is. Every event is interpreted not so much by its action, but its mood. 1:09 a.m. Visions dulled out, but the tactile hallucinations were still strong. I started feeling a huge sense of freezing. I was shaking, I felt so cold. I collected my thoughts and got out of the tank. Upon further inspection the next morning, one of the heaters went out and the water temperature must have dropped. Audio hallucinations seemed to bounce off everything in the room. I made an attempt to jot down some notes about the tank before I forgot them. Coordination was definitely way off, judging from my penmanship. At about 1:30, I took 1 milligram of Xanax to go to sleep. The next day, I continued to have tactile sensations and my right leg was very sore, was slightly groggy from the Xanax. All in all, the trip was not the success I was looking for. I had no religious visions or anything I could even remotely assume was spiritual. I did gain some insight, so it was not a failure. My plans are to purchase a used tank, something more reliable and less likely to conk out on me. I may increase the dose to 20 grams of morning glory.